But we yesterday were in Masechet Shavuot. Daf Yud is today, number 10, the 28th day of the Omer in this year. And we are talking about the many different opinions in the Mishnah about which Karban Sa'ir is mechaper for which sin. So we got up to the opinion yesterday of Rabbi Shimon, who said that the Seirei Regalim are mechaper for people who are tamei and go into the Beit HaMikdash and don't know about it, right? They aim by yediyah lo b'tchila, lo basof, but not Rosh Chodesh. Rosh Chodesh is for something else. It's for ta'ar shachal tamei, right? So that's a person who's tahar, who eats meat of kachim that's tamei, which is a lower level isser, not an isser of karet. So we asked yesterday, how does Rabbi Shimon derive this? And then we started discussing it. So we are now 5 lines from the bottom of Daf Tet Amud Bet, the word in the middle of the line. So 5 lines from the bottom. Says the Gemara, Ashkechan Seirei Rashi Chadashim. We have found yesterday that the Sayer of Rosh Chodesh is mechapri al tahar shachal tamei. That is mechaper on a tahar who eats something that's tamei. You learned it out yesterday from the tzitz, if you recall. And we also derive 3 lines from the bottom that Seirei Regalim, that the Sirim, the Musaf of the Sa'ir that you bring on every holiday, except for Yom Kippur, is Mechapri al She'im B'Yidiyah Lo B'Tchila V'Lo B'Sof Manola. That's the question. How do you know that the Sirei Regalim are Mechaper on a person who commits a sin but doesn't know about it, not before and not after? Keda'amar V'Chamer Rabbi Chanina. Says Gemara, it's like we said yesterday, it's Rabbi Chamer Rabbi Chanina. Did I do this yesterday? I think we did this. Sa'ir V'Sa'ir. It says the extra Vav V'Sa'ir. Hachanami Sa'ir V'Sa'ir. Now the top words of Daf Yud Amud Aleph. Itgush, morning, we're at the top word of Daf Yud Amud Aleph. Itgush Seirei Regalim Seirei Rashi Chadashim. That we compare Sa'ir of the Regel to the Sa'ir of Rosh Chodesh. Ma Sa'ir de Rashi Chodesh b'milta de Kodesh mechapri. Just like the Sa'ir of Rosh Chodesh forgives someone for a sin committed by mistake without knowledge of Kodesh, meaning a tahor who ate tamei, kachim that's tamei. Af Seirei Regalim b'milta de Kodesh mechapri. So too, the Sa'ir of the Regalim is mechaper on something to do with Kodesh. Now, by process of elimination, we're going to figure out what that something is. So, Chitema, you're going to say, well, maybe it does the same thing as Rosh Chodesh. Neima nichberu ad Rosh Chodesh. Let it be, say, okay, the Sa'ir of the Regalim are like the Sa'ir of Rosh Chodesh. Well, Ha'amrina, we said yesterday, Ota. It says by Rosh Chodesh that the Sa'ir is mechaper Ota, right? It said, we quoted the pasuk yesterday, that's not the pasuk. Where is the pasuk? Now say at Ovon, yeah, here we go. It says it carries the Avon of that person. So then it said Ota no say Avon, Oto no say Avon. It will Ota nasan Avon. It will carry the sin. Ve'in acher no say Avon. No other Sa'ir does the same thing as Rosh Chodesh. Well, maybe you should say that the Regalim are mechaper on the same thing as the Sa'ir of Yom Kippur, right? Remember, the Sa'ir of Yom Kippur, the one that's done Nase B'chutz, the regular Musaf of Yom Kippur, is mechaper, we said, on people who have Yesh Ein B'Yediyah B'Tchila, Yesh B'Yediyah B'Sof. They don't know before that they're Tamei. They do it. They then find out, someone tells them, or they watch the video, they found out they were Tamei. There, they can't bring a Karban Levi or Eid according to most opinions, but Yom Kippur is Mechaper. Maybe Chagim, the Regalim, are Mechaper for that also. On this we said, again, this is all repetition, but it's good review. We said Achat B'Shana, that it says by Yom Kippur that this happens once a year. We read it yesterday, or is yesterday Shams? Yeah, yesterday. Kapara Zu Lo Te'el Achat B'Shana. The Kapara of Yom Kippur happens uniquely on Yom Kippur. Amai mechapri. So then, what should the Regalim be mechaper? What's left? If you're talking about a regular case where you knew you were tamei, you forgot, you went into Beit HaMikdash and then you remembered that you don't need a separate musaf. High bar carbon, that's where you bring a carbon levi or eight. If you're talking about a case where you know in the beginning, but then you never find out, right? You don't know that you did the sin. We said this Sa'ir Naseh Bifnim is mechaper, it's toleh. Hi Sa'ir Naseh Bifnim Yom Kippurim toleh. The third case, where you didn't know you were tamei, you went in, then you found out you were tamei, so you didn't know before, but you knew after. We just said Sa'ir Naseh B'chutz V'Yom Kippurim mechaper, and it can only be mechaper that day, no other day. Al karchach, therefore, the only category left behind by process of elimination is that the sa'ir of the regalim is eina mechaper al she'en b'yediyah lo b'tchila v'lo b'sof. The sa'ir of the regalim is mechaper on a person who unwittingly commits an act without knowing before, not knowing after. They totally blindly walked into the sin, but it still is considered to be a sin, and we still want a kapara, and that is what we bring the sa'ir of the regalim to be mechaper for that person. Okay, so now we're up to the two dots, to the next opinion in the Mishnah, which was the third opinion of Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Meir said, Kol hasirin kaparatan shaveh. Says Rabbi Meir, I disagree with this whole logic that the Sa'ir of Rosh Chodesh is for this, and Yom Kippur is for that, and this is for that. They all do the same thing, meaning the Sa'ir of Rosh Chodesh, the Sa'ir of Yom Kippur that's done outside, the Sa'ir of the Regalim are all mechaper for Tumot, Mikdash, Ukdoshav, all of these cases. So it's not like there's a difference. The only one that's different is the Sa'ir Nasa Bifnim, which we'll see in the Gemara, even according to Rabbi Meir, is its own category. Now, Amar Rabbi Chama Rabbi Chanina, my time with Rabbi Meir. What's the source for Rabbi Meir to say that all Seirim Kaparatan Shaveh? Amar Kran, this we quoted 2 times already. It says, instead of saying the word Seir Echad Chatat, it says Seir with the Vav. Hukshu Kol HaSeirim Zeh Lezeh. The Vav is Mosif, right? It's telling you that all of the Seirim are similar, and Vav Mosif Al Inyan Rishon. The Vav adds to the first thing. So basically, we compare each one to each other. So mainly, the Torah told me Rosh Chodesh is mechaper on A. Every other Sa'ir does A also. The Torah said that Yom Kippur is mechaper on B. Every other Sa'ir does B, etc. So you compare them all to each other. Now, Kasav Daitach, we assume when we first read this, meaning 3 seconds ago, that Kol Chav Echad Mechavri Gomer, meaning that it was a chain reaction. That basically we learned that Rosh Chodesh is mechaper on A. The next one, which the Torah says next, is Pesach. Pesach is like Rosh Chodesh. Then we say Shmini Shel Pesach, Shvi Shel Pesach, and then we say Atzeret, let's say. Shvi Shel Pesach is like the first day of Pesach, meaning we learn one from each other. The problem with that is, Amar Rabbi Yochanan has a very famous statement, that Kol HaTorah Kula L'meidin Lamad Milamad. Throughout the entire Torah, if you learn something else from a Gzeir Shava or a Hekesh, you can then take that and learn something else from that, right? You learn a learned thing to the next thing. Chutz mikachim. But the exception, which is relevant to us, is kachim. She'ein lemedin lamad milamad. You can't do a chain reaction of limudim. So if you learn Pesach from Rosh Chodesh, you can't then learn Atzeret from Pesach, if Pesach is not a primary source. Says, you're right, but you misunderstood the explanation. What it was is what I said in the beginning, because I already knew this Gemara, is that Kulu Mikama Gemiri. Every Sa'ir is learned from the source. Kama means the source. So if the Torah says by Yom Kippur you do something, every other Sa'ir is like Yom Kippur. If the Torah says by Rosh Chodesh you do something, every other Sa'ir is like Rosh Chodesh. It's not that you learn Pesach from Rosh Chodesh and Shevuot from Pesach and Sukkot from Shevuot. It doesn't go that way. Each one goes to the original source, even though it's many different sources. So that is how we understand it. It says the Gemara, that's a very nice explanation. But if you go through the Psukim, which we did recently on Pesach, right? If you go through the Psukim, well, you go through some of them at least, the Psukim for each day, if you notice that it does not say Usir Izim Echad Chatat by every day, right? First of all, it doesn't say, and Sukkot is very funny because they're not all identical. Some say Hashem, some don't say Hashem. But on Atzeret, by Shavuot, the one coming up, it does not say Avav, and by Yom Kippur it doesn't say Avav. So says Gemara, what about Atzeret Yom Kippur Vis Sa'ir Minalan? They're out of the list, right? Everything says Avav to combine them except for 2. So what do you do about those 2? Ella says Gemara, you're right. Basically throughout Reb Chama Reb Chanina, which is troubling because we used him twice for other Tanaim. But the real source is Amar Reb Yonah, Amar Kra, that the pasuk says at the end, Eila taseh Hashem b'moadechem. These are done for Hashem on the moed, meaning hukshu kol moadim kulan zelazeh, that there is a commonality, a hekesh, right, a comparison between the karbanot of every moed. So that says Rabbi Meir, this pasuk of Eila taseh Hashem b'moadechem at the end of the parsha brings them all together, brings it all home, and it basically is telling you that every musaf of Sa'ir that's done on a holiday, including Yom Kippur, and including Rosh Chodesh, and including all the Chagim, they all overlap. They all have the same function. The function is to be mitaher, to purify Tumat Mikdash Ukdoshav, people who can't bring a karban, because they didn't know before, or they didn't know after, they didn't know at all, but they did something wrong in the Mikdash Ukdoshav. Again, I said a few times, Gemara has not said it yet, that this excludes the Sa'ir Bifnim of Yom Kippur. Excludes the Sa'ir Bifnim. Says the Gemara, though, I have 2 dots in my Gemara. I don't know if every Gemara is the same 2 dots, but 2 dots around 10 lines from the bottom of the narrow lines. Says the Gemara, that's a really great limud, but one of those days is not a holiday. Which day is not a holiday? Rosh Chodesh, right? What do you mean Rosh Chodesh is a holiday? It's not, we don't refrain from doing work on Rosh Chodesh. We don't have Rosh Chodesh, lav moedu. Rosh Chodesh is not a moed. So if you learn a pasuk of Elat Asel Hashem b'moadechem, you can compare all the moadim, and Yom Kippur can be a moed, and Rosh Hashanah can be a moed, but how do you get Rosh Chodesh to be a moed? Says Gemara, well, although it's not technically a moed, Ivra, the truth is, Rosh Chodesh nami ikri moed, that we do refer to Rosh Chodesh sometimes as a moed. Again, it's not clearly a bona fide moed. It's not asur b'melacha. It doesn't have the regular rules, but in fact, it has some aspects of moed. Kedamar Abaya, as Abaya said, we quoted this in Ta'anit, Damar Abaya, Tammuz dahishata miluye milyua. We were discussing, if you recall, that the year of the second year of the Exodus, of the leaving Egypt, the Jews were in the desert, right? And they, after the second year, remember the first year did the sin of the Egel, and then they had the Mishkan came, and we had the commandments, and the Egel, and the Mishkan. The second year, they get ready to travel to go to Israel, and of course, things go wrong because the Meraglim happened, right? So they say we're going to send out Meraglim, and because they said they were going to send out Meraglim, basically they did the Meraglim, they sinned, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so that is the second year. Now, if you recall the dates, remember we have a tradition, as Gemara said in Ta'anit, that the night that the day the Meraglim came home was the 8th day of Av, and that night that all the people cried was Tisha B'Av, right? And that it became a tradition. God said, you cried on this day, I'm going to make you cry Lidorot on this day of Tisha B'Av. But if you do the math, and the Gemara in Ta'anit did the math, it turns out that usually the month of Tammuz, which comes before Av, has 29 days. And if the month of Tammuz has 29 days, then the day that the Meraglim came back would be the 9th day of Av, and the day they would cry was the 10th day of Av. So you'd be short one day, or you'd be long one day. So the Gemara explained, the Abaya explained. Now I'll read inside. Amar Abaya, where am I? Amar Abaya, the Amar Abaya, Tammuz dahi shata miluye milyua. The Tammuz of that year had a full moon, meaning a full month. There were 30 days. So Tammuz is one extra day, and basically you walk back days in Av. The Meraglim came back on the 8th day of Av, and the day that everyone cried, that night that everyone cried, was the 9th day of Av. Tichtiv, and Abai says it's based on the pasuk in Eicha, which of course we read on Tisha B'Av, which says, Kara alai moed l'shbar b'churai. I called a moed in order to destroy and conquer my chosen ones. So the simple explanation of the pasuk is that Hashem made a day, Tisha B'Av, to destroy us. But Rabbi darshans this pasuk to mean that Hashem made it that the month of Tammuz was longer, and therefore Moed, it refers to here like the Moed of the moon was extra, so that it became out on Tisha B'Av. But basically, we're calling the new moon, the Rosh Chodesh, a Moed, and so that is the source.
So how can you have a source from Ketubim defining Torah law?
Right, so it's a great question, and I mean, I would just say I tried to sort of anticipate that by saying that clearly it's not a moed, right? There's no doubt that we don't refrain from doing work, there's traditions and things, but so I think what Abaya is saying is that there is a tradition that although Rosh Chodesh is not the same kind of moed, it is a type of moed. So it's not really a source, I would say. It's telling you more a literary way that we refer to Rosh Chodesh as a moed. That kind of thing, essentially Giloi Milta, right? You can reveal it from Ketubim. It's not a teaching. It reveals what the common terms and knowledge were. So we often do that we use Ketuvim or Nevi'im sometimes to tell you what a word means or what context we mean, not a halacha per se. Says Rabbi Yochanan now, what I've told you many times, 5 lines from the last narrow line. Moder Rabbi Meir, who says all the Seirim are the same, he says not all the Seirim. He admits b'sayir anaseh b'fnim shu eino mechaper kaparatan. He admits that the Sa'ir that's done inside a Yom Kippur is different. it does not mean mechaper for what the outside and Rosh Chodesh and Yom Tiv is. They ain't mechaperim kaparato, and they don't do its kapara. Who ain't mechaper kaparatan? It does not work for them. Kapara achat mechaper mein mechaper shtei kaparot. It said, we learned this all earlier. It said kapara achat, right? That Yom Kippur can do one, not many. That at least that carbon of Yom Kippur. Hein ena mechaperim kaparato, because amarkra achat b'shana. They can't. You can't say that Rosh Chodesh does what Yom Kippur does, because it says you do it once a year. Achat kapara zilotei al achat b'shana. You only have this once a year. And Tanya Nami in the first wide line, there's a Braita that says this explicitly. And I'll quote the Braita. Al she'ein ba'yediyah lo b'tchila v'lo b'sof. The person goes into Beit HaMikdash tamei, but didn't know before or after. And al she'ein ba'yediyah b'tchila v'yesh ba'yediyah b'sof. A person went in, they didn't know before, but they knew after. V'al tahar shachal tamei. And this is the Rosh Chodesh case, right? A tahar person who ate kachim that's tamei. In all those cases, sirei regalim, sirei rashi chadashim, seir nasa b'chutz mechaprin divrei Rabbi Meir, and that's the end of the Braita. But notice what we left out of the list. Ilo seir nasa b'fnim shaira. We left out a seir the nasa b'fnim, which is not listed in that group, and kaparata nami sharia, and the kapara of that, which is for a person who ate yesh ba'yediyah b'tchila, ve'en ba'yediyah b'sof, was left out of the list too. So clearly, even according to Rabbi Meir, that's a category of its own. Okay, so that is, now we have the three opinions of Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Shimon, and Rabbi Meir. Now, if you recall, we're at the two dots now at the bottom. If you recall, in our Mishnah, we went back to Rabbi Meir to have an interesting discussion about what happens if you have a sa'ir that's dedicated for Yom Kippur, but you don't need it for Yom Kippur, runs away and you find a different one, and then Sukkot is here. Can you use that sa'ir for Sukkot? So Rabbi Shimon said, yes, you can. And the Gemara said, well, how can you do that? The Mishnah said, how can you do that? They're different. And he said, well, they're not different entirely. They're all mechaper on tumat mikdosh ukdoshav. So now said the Gemara, Rabbi Shimon Omer. Now we have the summary from the Mishnah. Rabbi Shimon said that and then he went on and on. With all the cases in the Mishnah. So it says I understand, 6 lines from the bottom, 2 dots. We're going to go over this. Again, this is repetitive to us who learned the daf yesterday and the day before. Even yesterday. I understand that Rosh Chodesh is not mechaper on the same thing as the regalim. The makra avon. It says by Rosh Chodesh that the sa'ir of Rosh Chodesh carries the avon, that's singular. Avon achat hu nosei, echad hu nosei, deino nosei shtei avonot. It only carries one avon, not many things. Ella, why doesn't it work the other way? Why don't you say, the regalim nichperia de Rosh Chodeshim? Why don't you say that the sa'ir of the regel should mechaper Rosh Chodesh? Well, there we said amakra ota, that it said by Rosh Chodesh, it, right? Ota nosei avon, it carries the sin, vein acher nosei avon. Okay, again, we're just reviewing. And now the next case, Bishma de regalim lo mechaper ad Yom Kippurim. I understand that what works according to Rabbi Shimon for Yom Kippur does not work for the regel. The Amar Krux, the pasuk says about Yom Kippur, achat b'shana, kaparazu. What the Sa'ir of Yom Kippur does, lo tehel achat b'shana. Ella, now this is the question. Why don't you say that Yom Kippurim nichpura de regalim? Why don't you say Yom Kippur does 2 things? It's mechaper on its special thing of Yom Kippur, which is ein ba'yediyah b'tchila, yesh ba'yediyah b'sof. And it works like the regalim, because Yom Kippur is a regel, and Shemim mechaper on ein ba'yediyah lo b'tchila v'lo b'sof. Amar Kra says the Gemara, well, it's because the pasuk says achat, that Yom Kippur has one function. Now, this is referring to the year, but we darshan it in this way. Kapara achat mechaper in mechaper shtei kaparot. Right? That Yom Kippur is what once a year, this kapara of Yom Kippur happens, meaning it's only for one thing, not for many things. It says Gemara, but 1 second. When it says the word achat by Yom Kippur, it's referring not to the sa'ir naseh b'chutz, which is the question, but the sa'ir naseh b'fnim, which no one is even discussing. It says, well, you're right, but Amar Kra, the pasuk says, now turn the page, milvad chatata kippurim. The pasuk by inside says milvad chatata kippurim, meaning it says this one, besides the one that's outside, the itkush chitzon lepnimi, to compare them, to say that in the context of this one, you have to think about the other one as well, and that they are compared to each other. And just like the inside a sa'ir, which is a chatat of Yom Kippur, is mechaper on only one thing, the outside chatat of sa'ir is only mechaper on one thing. Now, the final case in the Mishnah, was another variation of Rabbi Shimon. And in this variation of Rabbi Shimon did not say that every Sa'ir of Regel, Rosh Chodesh, and Yom Kippur is individual. He said they're cumulative, right? That the Sa'ir of Rosh Chodesh is Mechaper for one thing, which is Tahar Shachal to Tameh. The Sa'ir of Regalim is Mechaper on that, plus add a second one, which is Ein B'Yediyah Lo B'Tchila V'Lo B'Sof. The Sa'ir of Yom Kippur is those two, plus a third, which is Ein B'Yediyah B'Tchila Avayesh B'Yediyah B'Sof. So now we're going to have to go through each of these limudim to understand how does this version of Rabbi Shimon know that in some ways they're connected, and in some ways they're not connected, meaning that Yom Kippur can cross over, but Rosh Chodesh can't cross over, for example. So Rabbi Shimon ben Yehuda Amar Mishmo, it says them right now, I don't get it. What's the reason that you said Rosh Chodesh only is mechaper for its thing, but it's not mechaper for the regalim? Damarkra avon, and you darshan that avon echad hu nosei and nosei shtei avonot, right? So Rosh Chodesh does one thing, not two things. But then the regalim nami no nichbara Rosh Chodeshim. So why don't you say the same thing we just said 10 lines ago, that the regalim can't overlap and be mechaper on the Rosh Chodesh. Damarkra ota. It says it carries the avon. Otahu nosei avon ve'inacher nosei avon. Well, according to this opinion, ota lo mashmalei. Ota is the way the pasuk speaks. It doesn't necessarily mean to limit the chapara from the regel not being on Rosh Chodesh. It's okay. So that's a straightforward answer. You can argue with it, but it's a straightforward answer. The next question is, what about regel and Yom Kippur? We said the regel is mechaper on certain things, but not for what the Sa'ir of Yom Kippur does. Why? Because the Torah says about Yom Kippur, it happens once a year, not on every regel. But if by that logic, why don't you do the reverse? Say the reverse, that Yom Kippurim namilo nichbara regalim, right? That Yom Kippur should not be forgiving the sin. The Sa'ir of Yom Kippur should not forgive sins that are forgiven for Rosh Chodesh, for regel, because achad kiv, it says one, meaning kapara achat mechaper and mechaper shtei kaparot. So he said, well, achat no mashmalei, right? The achat is not mashma that implication. What are you talking about? You just use the word achat to say that regel can't be Yom Kippur. And that because it says achat by Yom Kippur, only one can be Yom Kippur. Then you said, well, Yom Kippur can be regel because the achat by Yom Kippur I don't care about. Says, why? And the answer is what we just said before. When it says achat, it was referring to the Sa'ir Nasa Bifnim. So the achat of the kapara is saying this can only do one thing, was really not referring to the Sa'ir B'chutz. And therefore the Sa'ir Nasa B'chutz in Yom Kippur can be mechaper on many things, right? Says the Gemara, well, then I'm going to go back towards the same logic. By that logic, then the achat doesn't matter. If the achat doesn't matter, then diregalim nami nichbarad Yom Kippurim. Why don't you say that the Sa'ir of the regel is mechaper on the same thing as Yom Kippur? You just said that can't be because it says one by Yom Kippur, but you just told me the one by Yom Kippur doesn't matter. Says, well, you're right. La'olam, the truth is achat mashmalei. That in fact the word achat does imply that Yom Kippur is unique, and the kapara of Yom Kippur is only for Yom Kippur, and it can't cross over, and the regalim can't be mechaper for Yom Kippur, and Yom Kippur can't be mechaper for the regalim. Why did Rabbi Shimon, this is Rabbi Shimon and Rabbi Yehuda, say that Yom Kippur is mechaper for the regalim? Shani hacha, this is different, because there's another pasuk that we're quoting now, which says, this is the end of Parshat Titzaveh, it says, V'chiper Aharon al karnotav achat b'shana. Aaron will be mechaper on its horns. Remember the Karen of the Mizbeach is referring to Karen Mizbeach Pnimi, right? Karnotav the Mizbeach HaPnimi hu de kapara achat mechaper. In a mechaper shtei kaparot. It's once a year on the inside Mizbeach that there's one kapara for one action and not many. Ha-dechitzon afilu shtei kaparot, but the Mizbeach HaChitzon, where you brought the Sa'ir HaNaseh B'chutz, right, by definition, the Sa'ir that was done outside can, in fact, on Yom Kippur, mechaper for many things. And therefore, period, which is the end of sort of the end explanation of our Mishnah, therefore says Rabbi Shimon ben Yehuda, in the name of Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai, that, in fact, the way the Karbonos work is that Rosh Chodesh does one, but because it said Avon, it can only do one. The Yom Tov Regel can do Rosh Chodesh and Regel, but it cannot do Yom Kippur because of the word Achat. Yom Kippur can do everything. It can do the regel, you can do Rosh Chodesh, but of course, it's only that which is done by the Sayar Nasa B'chutz, not B'ifnim. So that is, we're done actually. I know this was very exciting and challenging. We're done with that part of the mission. Now says the Gemara, we want to go to a total non sequitur, which we'll see why we're doing it, but you're not going to find out till tomorrow. So be patient. But we have a whole unrelated, seemingly unrelated halacha, but again, we will get back to why it's related. Says Ula Amr Rabbi Yochanan, we are around 12 or 14 lines from the bottom. 13, I was halfway in the middle. Sorry, says Ula Amr Rabbi Yochanan. You know, let's say, remember, if you recall in Masechet Tamid, sorry, in Masechet Zvachim, actually this is in Tamid too, but in Masechet Zvachim, we're going to have a discussion, which is from Masechet Tamid, about how they used to separate karbanot to be ready for Tamid. Remember, you didn't just wake up in the morning and say, let's go to the market and buy an animal and bring a karban Tamid. They would do hafrasha. And then we'll learn out, we're going to discuss this as we get to Kachim, how you know this. But they would basically set aside the animals for 3 days beforehand. And then the next day they would set aside 2 animals, the next day 2 animals. So there were always, 6 animals waiting. And then you would bring 2 on any given day. So there were basically 4 extra animals at the end of the day. And then you would add 2 more, right? Says the Gemara, what happens at the end of the year? So, you use money from Tafshin Pei Hey to buy these animals, but at the end of the year, there's just like the government, right? You can only use funds from 1 year for that year. Your grant money, right? We all have this problem. We used to have this problem. We had grants, but you can only use money from 1 year for that year, right? So at the end of the year, you can't say, well, we use money from Tafshin Pei Hey to buy these Timidim. There are 4 left, but it's Rosh Chodesh Nisan, which is when the year resets, right? How can we then bring those Timidim for the new year, which is not Tafshin Pei Vav, but the new year, which is after Nisan, if they were bought with money from last year? On the other hand, you can't take a carbon that's kachim and exchange it when it's still, right? The only way we generally exchange kachim is if it gets a mum, right? But these are healthy, live timidim. What do you do with the kedusha from these timidim? So says Ula, in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, timidim shel hutzuchu letzibor. If you have extra timidim at the end of the year, at the end of Adar, that are not used for that year, niftin tmimim. In fact, you can be put of them. What you do is you would take the animals, you would say, how much are they worth? You go to the store, right? Say you sell them for $1,000. The $1,000 then becomes Kodesh. Take that $1,000 and buy new animals for the new year, right? Let's say. So that was what Rabbi Ula said in the name of Rabbi Yochanan. Now, the reason would be, we'll get into this tomorrow, that because it's tzorach of the tzibor, right, that the rule that you can't be podeh kachim is only if it's an individual. If I have my own carbon chatad and I say, I don't like this animal anymore, I want to buy a different animal, you can't do that. But for tzibor, you can do it. So Yativ Rabbah v'kamal hashmaita. So Rabbah was sitting and he heard Ula say this shmaita that he heard from Rabbi Yochanan. Ula was so excited. Amalei Rabbah said to him, that's ridiculous. I'm sorry, not Rabbah, sorry. Rabbah said the shmaita, and Amalei Rav Chisda said to Rabbah, Man sayat lecha Rabbi Yochanan Rabbah. Who would ever listen to you and Rabbi Yochanan your Rebbe? You guys are ridiculous. How could such a thing happen? How do you put this something that's Kodesh? You can't just take something that's tahar, that's carbon, and just say, we're going to exchange the Kedusha. There's no such thing. It doesn't happen ever that you take the Kedusha for something that's Kodesh without a mum, without its inability. You have to bring it on the Mizbeach. What do you do here? I'm not sure. But maybe let them, graze until they get a mum and then be podeh, or maybe die, whatever. But how could you be podeh something without a mum? So now Rabbah defended Rabbi Yochanan. I don't get it. That you really don't think that there are no cases where you don't say that, right? Meaning there's no cases where you do say that, sorry. Where you do say something is Kodesh, but we don't use it anymore. We don't need it because it's for the Tzibor. Let's be podeh. What about the Mishnah that everyone loves in Shkalim? Let's not. Right, we have a Mishnah in Masechet Shkalim, which is a similar case with the Ketoret. Remember that when they did the Ketoret, they would grind up a certain amount of Ketoret to be ready, prepared. At the end of the year, there were extra Ketoret. There had to be. Partly because on Yom Kippur, they made extra for the Kohen Gadol. And let's just say there was extra. So you had extra Ketoret at the end of the year. Now, you can't use it for the new year because anything that was bought with money from year X can't be used in year Y. So what? But it's tar. There's nothing wrong with this Ketoret. So what do you do with the Ketoret? So it says the Mishnah in Masechet Shkalim, that's not. Motar ha-Ketoret, the extra Ketoret at the end of the year, ma'yo osinba, what would you do with it? So now, What you can't do is you can't take the Ketoret and say, well, this Ketoret is worth $100. We're going to, exchange it for $100 and use that money in the new year. What you did was you would do something different. Mafrishin schar ha'umnin. What you do is you would say, people who work here, we have to pay the people who make the Ketoret, right? It's a very hard job and a very important job. So we discussed elsewhere the schar that they got. They were the workers, they got paid. So you would basically say, look, here's $1,000 that we're putting aside to pay the salary of the grinders for the Ketoret, right? Those are the umnin who make the Ketoret. Take that $1,000 that is now really belongs to the umnin, and say, we will exchange the kedusha of the Ketoret for the money of the umnin. And basically, we're paying the umnin in Ketoret. Now, we can't literally pay them in Ketoret because it's Kodesh. So we convert the Ketoret to Chulin by putting its Kedusha on the money, and we pay them by giving them the Ketoret. Now, we don't really give them the Ketoret because notin oto le'umnin b'scharan. What we do, we give the Ketoret to the umnin as their schar because the Kedusha has gone off the Ketoret to the money. And then we say to them, before you leave, we want to buy that back from you, right? But instead of giving them the same money that we just used, we give them new money from this year. And so basically this sounds like money laundering, right? You washed the money by taking money from last year and giving it to the umnin and taking money from this year and buying back the Ketoret. And now you can use the Ketoret for the current year. So that's the Mishnah. Says Rabbah to Rav Chisda, you learn this Mishnah. This Mishnah clearly says, take the Ketoret, which are Kodesh, which have no Tumah, which could be brought on the Mizbeach, and exchange them for money. What about the Kedusha? Well, you don't say, why you can do that? Name a Kedusha Sheman Leichan Hocha. So clearly, there are circumstances where at the end of the year, we have extra leftover animals or Ketoret, and we allow, because it's the Torah of the Tzibor, because it's communal need, we allow you to be poded. Said Rav Chisda, that's a very nice question, but that has nothing to do with anything. Amar Le, said Rav Chisda to Rabbah, Ketoret Kamrit? Of course I know the Mishnah in Shkalim about Ketoret, but Ketoret are not Kedushat HaGuf. Shani Ketoret to Kedushat Damimu. Ketoret are something that are Kedushat Damim. Now they are brought on the Mizbeach, but what Rav Chisda is saying is that they don't become roy for the Mizbeach until you put them in a Kli Sharet. Right, until you bring them to the temple, you put them into the Kli. You didn't do that yet. The Ketoret are sitting on a shelf in the Ketoret storage house. They're not Kodesh yet. They belong to Hekdesh. They're Kedushat Damim. But an animal that you're Makdish as a Karban, an Ola, has Kedushat HaGuf. And what I'm saying, says Rav Chisda, is that sure, Kedushat Damim of Ketoret, in a time of need, you can exchange for money. But the Kedushat HaGuf, the Kedusha of the body of a Karban, you can't exchange. And if you can't exchange it, how in the world did you say that at the end of the year you take the Karban Tamid and you exchange it for money? And that is the question. I'm going to stop here at the top line of Daf Yud Aleph Amud Aleph in the middle, so you're not going to get the answer. The reason is that the Gemara goes on a tangent and you don't get the answer for around the end of the page. But the Gemara tomorrow will get on a side note of whether or not Ketoret are in fact Kedushat Damim or Kedushat HaGuf. At the end of the day, we're going to conclude that they are Kedushat Damim, and then basically Rav Chisda's question comes back, which is, only Ketoret can be exchanged because they're Kedushat Damim, but how can a Tamid be exchanged, which is Kedushat HaGuf? And you're going to have to wait on the edge of your seat till tomorrow to find out that answer. So Yasher Koach, everyone.
You're as bad as Rabbi Schwartz with the cliffhangers.
You got to keep you coming back. Shevuot Tov. I'll see you. I'm going to be back in Riverdale, God willing, next Shabbat. But I'll see you Motzei Shabbat.
Shevuot Tov.
But,